Your Excellencies, the ongoing Ukraine crisis presents new challenges to Africa. Difficulties in accessing grains, fertilizers, and petroleum products have led to galloping inflation in many of our countries, which we are just about to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Mindful that Africa's problems are for Africans to solve, Afreximbank has once again stepped in and put in place a $4 billion facility to enable African countries to respond to the Ukraine crisis. It is therefore evident that Afreximbank has become a vital instrument for crisis intervention. The successes of the interventions reminds us of the urgency not only to support our own institutions, but to make them stronger and more effective. With its limited resources, Afreximbank made a significant impact in helping Africa to contain the pandemic. A stronger Afreximbank, and indeed a stronger group of African development finance institutions, can be one of the solid pillars on which Africa's development can be built. Your Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, looking ahead, we can no longer accept that after 60 years of independence, Africa remains weak and economically fragmented. If the Ugandan government wants to award a road contract to an Egyptian or South African, it must make sure it has foreign currency to pay for the works. The consequence is that trade is diverted and African contractors become disadvantaged in bidding for contracts within Africa. Similarly, a truck cannot travel and carry goods from Cairo to Cape Town without posting multiple transit bonds. And why is it that standards for simple goods used in Kenya are different from those in Senegal? Afreximbank is a firm believer that we can only begin to resolve these questions through aggressive pursuit of intra-African trade and supporting the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement implementation. And through our intra-African trade division, we have in the past 5 years disbursed over $20 billion in support of intra-African trade. And we plan to double this figure in the next 5 years, thanks to the capital increase that is in process. And thanks for the Egyptian shareholders for supporting that capital increase.
Delegates from Africa and beyond trooped to the new administrative capital of Egypt for the 29th annual meetings of the Africa Export-Import Bank. The theme this year explores how to realize the potential of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement in the post-COVID-19 era while leveraging on the power of the youth. President Benedict Oramah shared the relevance of this year's theme and why it is a major focus for the bank group. I'm Kenneth Igbomo, and I'll bring you the major highlights from the event. Countries across Africa are still building back from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has threatened Africa's development progress. This year's meeting is happening at a time where geopolitical tensions between Russia and Ukraine continues to pose new challenges for Africa. Therefore, implementing the AFCFTA becomes paramount, especially for key stakeholders in Africa's growth story.
For over 3 decades, I have been a champion and an activist. I'm a bit less of an activist now because I'm older, of African integration. I think the future of our continent lies in the north of Africa looking south and the south of Africa looking north. It is not acceptable for us to be able to travel in Africa with European passports easier than it is with African passports. It is not acceptable It is not acceptable for Africa to be deindustrializing, and I think you've just pointed out what's going on, because we refuse to electrify our continent. Industries require electricity at a higher level. That should be happening. It is not happening. The issue of COVID, Ukraine, the global supply chain, that will be solved. Governments will work to solve it. Multilateral agencies will do it, and price adjustments will do it. But ultimately, we have to draw lessons from what's going on. And that lesson is that Africa must work to integrate its payment system, its transportation. It must work to build scale, because only by building scale do you begin to absorb shock when it happens.
Ukraine crisis, the price shocks, the duplication of the fuel prices, as well as the strategic crops and the threats to food security, since Egypt depends a lot on importing a lot of strategic crops. So the reform, the economic reform process actually has achieved a lot of these to have reserves of these strategic crops, and we have managed to reorganize our foreign trade in a way that does not impact our production, in order for us to give priority to the citizens in terms of foreign currency. Of course, all of this has called to reorganize our use of foreign currency, because, of course, these are very bad circumstances for the whole world.
Let me say that Professor Rama made the task very easy for me, because he outlined the portfolio of lending they are doing across Africa to promote intra-African trade. And since there's very limited time, I'm just going to give you 3 examples. Mm-hmm. One is the issue of quality infrastructure. In order to promote safety and quality assurance, to promote competitiveness, and also remove technical barriers to trade, we need quality infrastructure. So we are working with the African Standards Organization, ASO, and we've come up with an African quality policy document, which was endorsed by the ministers responsible for industry, as well as the heads of state and government. And on that basis, we're going to develop the Made in Africa standard. And that is going to prompt the development of, or the increased investments in manufacturing. Secondly, the issue of manufacturing itself. The African Export-Import Bank has developed an automobile strategy, and is going to come to the ministers of trade, the ministers of industry, for endorsement at the African Union. And when that is done, it's going to open up market possibilities for car manufacturers across Africa to invest in the automobile industry. And already they've availed $1 billion for that. So it is generating interest by the private sector to invest, and also creating a revenue base for the African Export-Import Bank. The third example, which is the final, is a question of export divestation. Way back in the 1970s, Africa's share of global trade was 6%. And right now, as I'm talking to you, it's around 2.7%. And therefore, we needed to redress this slide. And we are working with the African Export-Import Bank to come up with an export development and export divestation program. And through that program, we expect a lot of interest from companies that want to export beyond Africa, in the rest of the world, to come up with the high-quality products and ensure that we go into manufacturing, agro-processing, and trade in services exports.
I think it is important for the continent to expect external assistance. And I don't think there is any shame or sort of conversations around that. If we remember, the next deepest crisis before this 2020 crisis was the financial When we had the financial crisis, the international community came together and issued something that we call special drawing rights, which is essentially printing additional resources to help the then European countries that were struggling with the financial crisis to come out of that crisis. So we believe that today, as Africa and as the developing world is struggling, we need the international community to issue new special drawing rights so that Africa can actually manage. The governor of the central bank just talked about shoring up the currency of Egypt, which means strengthening the currency. If we get special drawing rights, Egypt gets $2.8 billion tomorrow morning in the central bank. That is an additional 7% of its reserves. Egypt today imports about $2.8 billion of wheat, grain, and other things from Russia and Ukraine. The price of that has gone up by 47%. You need additional resources to be able to do that. So that's the first thing. We need resources from the international community. We need it yesterday, we need it now. Of course, the second thing that we need is to improve on domestic resource mobilization. Maybe one of the silver linings of the crisis has been that logistics trade has increased. The Suez Canal, and again, congratulations to Egypt and all the work that you've been doing, imports and revenues from the Suez Canal are up about 60%. You're getting about $66 billion just last year from the Suez Canal traffic and transit trade. All transportation costs has gone up by almost 30%. So there is revenue there that we can put back in. But finally, I think one other thing that we have to do is trade more with each other. Because if we trade more on the continent with each other, $2.8 billion of wheat coming from Russia, another $2-point-something billion of combined imports from Ukraine and other places, we could actually trade that on the continent, create more jobs.
After listening to the panelists, Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi raised some pertinent questions on how to make trade and integration work for the continent. He also made a call to the banking community in Africa.
You've been speaking from the economic perspective and from the perspective of the tracks of banks and so on. The last comment made by His Excellency Ekbi is the one that drew my attention the most, or it could be actually my starting point to speak about our African continent. I would like to say that we've been speaking about the African dream for so many years, and we're now speaking about the future till 2063, about our hope up till then. And now I would like to speak not only from an economic perspective, but from a state perspective. How can the states implement this on the ground? How can we turn all what we've been saying for all these years to realities on the ground? What's the barrier standing between the vision that could actually foresee the executive steps on the ground and our reality, not only in Africa, but throughout the whole world? I always say that comparisons and data provide us with a very good opportunity to get to know realities and goals as well as objectives. And here you mentioned integration. What about the infrastructure, the fit infrastructure that could actually accomplish achievements for Africa? How much would it cost? Where are we going to get these funds from? I said this 5 years ago in Germany. And I said that if you want to change the face of the African continent and turn it into an able continent that is capable of fulfilling the dreams and ambitions of its youth and peoples, then you need to have a proper infrastructure in the continent. And when you speak about electricity, it's infrastructure. The same applies to roads. The same applies to ports and airports. So how much and from where? These are the questions. I would like to address the banking community, the financing community. Africa is your responsibility. Africa is your responsibility. And the 1 billion plus citizens of Africa are your responsibility.
No doubt the implementation of the AfCFTA holds much promise for Africa. To get a situation report on the progress of the Continental Trade Pact, I met up with the man dotting the I's and crossing the T's, the Secretary General of the AfCFTA Secretariat, Wamkele Mene.
What is clear from President Orama's presentation is the commitment of Afreximbank to invest billions and billions of dollars. I think from one of his presentations in his report, over $35 billion that has been invested in trade finance and trade supporting infrastructure. That is absolutely critical for the success of the AfCFTA. If we want to move beyond it just being an agreement on paper, we have to invest in trade supporting infrastructure, and that's something that is not our responsibility as a secretariat. That's why we have a very close working relationship with both Afreximbank as well as the African Development Bank, because there are complementarities between our mandates. We reduce and eliminate barriers to trade. They bring in the trade finance that is required to make sure that goods transit through trade corridors in Africa. And so without the support and the complementarity and the collaboration between Afreximbank and ourselves and the African Development Bank, we will not be able to double intra-Africa trade by the year 2035 as we want to see.
To solve the regional trade challenge, making and receiving payments across borders must be demystified.
So this is a journey that started in 2017. Let me take that back. It started in 1963 when, as one of the resolutions passed at the setting up of the African Union, formerly called the OAU, the leaders of Africa actually envisioned that for us to actually grow our prosperity as a people, that we need to put in place a continent-wide payment system. So 60 years ago, almost 60 years ago, they envisioned this. It's been some time coming, but now we're setting around getting to achieve that. Now, payment is a critical element in trade. Trade does not happen without payments. So if you don't deal with the frictions around payments, then it becomes an inhibiting factor for trade. But once you deal with the issues around payments, then it can accelerate trade. So PAPS was commercially launched on January 13th, 2022. And since then, we have fully integrated 8 central banks. We've integrated the national switch in Nigeria, the national switch in Ghana, and we're integrating the national switch in the Gambia. We are now integrating central commercial banks across the entire region, okay? So we started with the 6 central banks in the WAMSI region, which is Nigeria, Ghana, Gambia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Now we've had another central bank in the East African flank, the Central Bank of Djibouti, join us. And then we've also had another central bank in the Southern African region join PAPS. So we've made some significant progress. Live transactions are actually flowing across some of the participants, but we are looking forward to a significant ramping up as we enter into Q3 of this year. And by the time we get into early next year, we can begin to see measurable impacts.
It's the issue of African trade. I think the time has come now that it is very clear that Africa, for us to progress and develop, we have to trade among ourselves. And it is very clear also that there is no issue of friendship that will make Africa develop. But we as Africans must see in ourselves that we trade among ourselves so that we'll be able to succeed. A lot of institutional framework are being put in place, particularly with our banking system in Afreximbank, African Development Bank, putting the enabling environment to be able to achieve this objective. So it is very clear that we cannot achieve the objective of develop socio-economic development without having trade among the African countries.
I think the African Free Trade Agreement is a good start. I presented some data, but we have seen data from others that intra-Africa trade is far behind the intra-continental trade of other regions like Asia and Europe and the Americas, so far behind. I think that Africa can easily triple intra-African trade, and this agreement is one way to move forward. However, and that's the big however, I think what shouldn't be neglected is the export orientation of trade. And that, I mean, obviously trade by definition means exports, but what I mean here is exports out of the African continent, specifically the earning of hard currency, so dollars, euros, yen, and Chinese yuan. This is vital if Africa is not going to hit a brick wall at a certain point. Now, I'm a student of history, and one thing I know is the inward-looking industrialization strategies of African countries as well as Latin American countries 40 years ago, maybe longer, 50 years ago now, they all collapsed because they ran out of foreign exchange. Sure, they substituted imports of certain manufactures, but the thing is, to produce those manufactures, you actually need to import the machines and raw materials and so on. And this means you need foreign exchange. Now, the bigger the production system, the more imports you get into. And what happened is the countries ran out of foreign exchange and they started to borrow. Then you got the great debt crisis of Latin America was the worst affected, but Sub-Saharan Africa was also badly affected. And they had to abandon that strategy. Actually, they were forced to as a condition for bailouts from the IMF and the World Bank and the advanced countries. Now, this is one aspect of it that Africa should not risk.
Understanding the uniqueness of each African country and what they bring to the table in terms of trade will go a long way to improve the volume of trade between African countries.
Single continental market for goods and services, expected free movement of business persons and investments, provides an opportunity for Africa and indeed Egypt as a country to take greater strategic approach to wean itself off the dependence of external partners for its developmental ambitions. I think President Sisi told us enough of that yesterday. The AfCFTA, which seeks to bring together 55 African countries and create a single integrated market, 1.3 billion people, GDP combined of 3.5 trillion, holds enormous potential for Africa's trade-led development. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, however, no matter how grounded the AfCFTA objectives are, they will remain elusive if the African private sector, also present here, is unable to take advantage of the opportunities offered by the AfCFTA. In fact, the AfCFTA is a necessary reform for our continent.
I think that up to 2017, the intra-African trade volume was 6% at most. But today, monitoring by us as private sector shows that there is a transformation for the intra-African trade figures. And this shows that there is a huge interest among the African countries and great interest in intra-African trade. What can the Egyptian private sector do in this respect? The Egyptian private sector has huge and deeply rooted experience in the main pillars of economy. The Egyptian private sector has experience in agriculture and agribusinesses and engineering industries, petroleum and oil and mining, as well as huge experience in textile industry, pharmaceuticals and construction material. Hence, I think that we can achieve a lot despite the challenges.
In 2018, I participated in the first IETF here, and I was very surprised personally to see the potential in terms of manufacturing in Egypt, to see how I didn't know that Egypt actually had a very big industry in terms of producing, manufacturing kitchen appliances, because I am also an entrepreneur who also have a restaurant, and I used to import my kitchen appliances from China. So I came in and I collected all these business cards, and I went back home very excited with my partner, and I said, these are now on the continent, we will be able to now import kitchen appliances from Egypt. Then the first action was to say, okay, let's start getting into contact and seeing how we can do that. I get into contact with my freight forward to say, how can we now ship, if we import from Egypt, how can we bring it to Lomé, where I come from? The first reaction was, it's going to be complicated. It's going to be complicated. It will take us longer than if it will take you if you bring from China. And then that's where the story stopped. So from my excitement, I actually didn't push forward because my freight forwarder said to me, it will be complicated.
The current location of Egypt and also the current status of development that is going on, we are almost doubling and tripling the sizes of our different maritime ports. We have increased the capacity of our Suez Canal. We have now moving into investment into approximately 10 to 12 new dry terminals with new free zones, with new intermodal connecting ports using different modes of transport, whether road, whether rail, and trying to tie the rail between the different countries and demographies.
Africa's private sector also has a lot to contribute if we are truly going to explore the full potential of the AfCFTA. Top-notch infrastructure that supports trade remains crucial for the efficient movement of goods and services across borders in a competitive manner.
The intra-Africa trade number is much lower than other regions, as we all know. So the question is, what do we need to do to catalyze and ensure that that number is actually growing? Because the horizon is quite sizable, and African economies need to grow. And I think the important realization for me in today's world, in the context of the Afreximbank annual general meetings, is the realization that you will never get to increase that number and realize the benefits of the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement unless you have two things. You have productive capacity, so that means industry, we need to be producing, and then two, the infrastructure to enable that trade. For me, that's the big take out of this context.
As we all know, we have seen that we have quite a lot of issues, as regards the Russian-Ukrainian war. You are right. The issue of food security is very, very important. Africa has 1.4 billion people, right? And yet we are importing almost 70% of the food that we consume. It's a non-fact, and there shouldn't be anything like that, because Africa is sitting on 60% of the world's arable land. So we have the water, we have the landmass, over 30 million square kilometers, yet we import what we eat. Last year, Africa imported over 55 million tons of wheat at the cost of almost $20 billion. So we are spending about $80–90 billion a year every year in Africa. So this shock has really exposed our vulnerability, and we need to do more. We need to look inwards. We need to be try as much as possible to be self-sufficient. We must be able to produce at least what we consume, because we don't have any business, importing food. Part of that wheat that I just mentioned, in fact, 40% of the wheat that Africa imported last year came from Ukraine. Ukraine is a small country, 44 million people, yet feeding 1.4 billion people. So really we need to look inwards. We need to do more to be able to produce what we need. This is what we need to do more than anything else, because we have seen it, it is happening. For example, I have a factory that I process wheat, producing pasta and flour. Last year, I was buying wheat at $250. Today, the cost of that same wheat is $600 per ton, which means that if I was spending, say, $100-200 million a year, now it has doubled. So, which means that I have to go and look for more foreign exchange, and there's no way I will be able to add the price of flour or pasta in Nigeria to double what I was selling last year. It's just not easy. And then I would have to contend with looking for the FX as well. So these are some of the areas that I believe that we must do more inwards so that we'll be able to at least be self-sufficient. Of course, we have other things that we are doing that are locally sourced. If you look at the cement business, 95% of what you use is coming from Nigeria. I don't have a problem with that business at all. Why? Because all my raw materials are coming from Nigeria within. And I'm selling in Nigeria and also exporting, not having to require any foreign exchange whatsoever as far as that business is concerned. So I think food security is very important. We really need to look inwards. This has exposed us. We now know that we need to do more. Otherwise, it will be a bigger problem going forward.
Yeah, because it's very interesting this is happening, because now I'm talking to two key private sector players here who can also add to the solutions that we're looking at here. And I'd like to hear from you, sir, looking at possible solutions from the private sector on how to maximize the opportunities in the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement.
I think first is the man you have here, Elijah Samar Ravi, is an industrialist, not just in cement, but also sugar and other agricultural produce. The point is we need to create what our people need in Africa, within Africa, so that we can support intra-Africa trade. Intra-Africa trade will not occur if we don't have what our people need. We need to have, our people need energy, they want to refine their petroleum products, we need to have that. They want refined petrochemical products, we need to have that. They want food, we need to have that. And all of this, as Samad said, are possible in Africa. We have arable land, we have the people, we have energetic young people, but what we lack is infrastructure, is access to capital. We need to make sure that we address this so that Africa will take off. We need improved access to electricity, which is why in our group, the Transcore group, we try our best in helping Nigeria to increase electric generation, and we supply to Benin Republic also. But beyond that is even access of finance by our young one. That's why the 28 Million Foundation, we're trying to support young African entrepreneurs, young men and women, give them economic hope and opportunity so that collectively all of us will help create the future of Samaz and the future to the Lumelu. That's our aspiration.
Tony has said it all. Infrastructure is key, because without infrastructure, there's no way, even the African Continental Free Trade Agreement we're talking about, there's no way it can succeed. He just said it. Power, for example. Africa is probably generating maybe about 120 gigawatts, right? Which is about 120,000 megawatts, the whole of Africa. A state in America, California is generating double that, one state, California. If you remove South Africa and Egypt, maybe we are only having about 60,000 megawatts, the whole of Africa. But you see, these things are easy. Look at what Mr. Al-Sisi has done in Egypt in the last 6-7 years. He's been able to put up maybe about 30,000 megawatts in less than 6 years. And using a local company, Al-Sawidi, so we can replicate that easily in Africa. So we need to do that, because without infrastructure, there is no way you can develop. Power is key. Power is a big issue in Africa. And most of the companies, for example, in Nigeria, power considerations form a substantial part of your capex toward the establishment of any huge business. Without power, there's no way you can do it. In some cases, up to 20-25%. So we really need to address those issues of infrastructure, ports, rails, roads, all those areas, because otherwise there is no way. I will tell you, it is more expensive to clear a container and transport a container from Nigeria to Kano than to import a container, bring a container from China to Lagos.
The launch of the Africa Trade Report was one of the major highlights of the annual meetings. The Africa Trade Report highlights the potential of the culture and creative industries, and they believe this sector could be the 21st century gold mine for Africa.
This is one of the annual flagship for the bank, and which every year reflect on the state of African trade and look at the major trend. I think it's quite clear to us that coming out of the pandemic, which was a difficult year for the world in terms of global demand and supply shocks, and the main highlight is that there was a very strong rebound from 2020 with global trade expanding by more than 26%. But more importantly, African trade expanded by more than 30%. And that was, again, a sign of increasing growth resilience for the continent. That's the major highlight. Another important highlight is that it's not just overall aggregate African trade that expanded strongly. Intra-African trade, which over the years has been essentially an effective absorber of global shocks, which is more resilient, also rebounded strongly by more than 18%. Another major highlight is that those rebounds within the region on the trade space were actually very much supported by the tremendous boost in commodities. And still on the trade space, it's also very important to stress that we've seen since 2018, Asia becoming Africa's largest trading partners, overtaking Europe, which for many decades has been Africa's main historical partner. I think they consolidated that trend in 2021, accounting for more than 32% of total African trade, extra-African trade, which is quite significant. If you look at the report, one of the most important aspects of the report, the thematic this year, it's on the creative. In other words, this is the first time that the report is devoted to the cultural and creative industries in Africa. And mind you, and the African Union made 2021 the African Years of Culture, the Years of African Culture. And we actually anchored the report on culture. So one of the fastest growing sector within the continent are essentially in the creative. Look at the movie industry, for instance. I think the growth prospects for the movie industry are significant. And in terms of income, I think Nigeria alone could generate more than $20 billion in the coming year, which is quite significant. 20 million jobs in the continent. I think that's an important sector.
When you look at the FCT, and especially in the area of creative industry, we're talking about music, we're talking about film, we're talking about photography, we're talking about fashion, gastronomy, and the like. You realize that we have a youth population of about 52 million. They're hugely talented, and what they need really is to acquire necessary skills and be provided with necessary infrastructure, such as platforms, to enable them really actualize their potentials, have platforms where they can exhibit their talents, and you can aim for the stars. Already Nigeria's music, Nigerian films are all over Africa, even before the after. Interestingly, you see, the creative sector doesn't wait for legal frameworks. Neither do they wait for treaties. Nigerian films have been shown everywhere in Africa for a long time. Burma Boy, Davido, and the likes. I think they are household names in all over Africa and the entire world. Now, what we need now is to look at how can they take advantage of this large market, which is actually supposed to be the largest, free trade market in the world. And this is why I think it's important for governments across the continent to embark on policies and programs that would enable these young men and women actualize their talents so that they can be seen all over Africa. And of course, this is where governments come in terms of infrastructure, in terms of policies.
Still on reports released at the annual meetings, a survey on African CEOs from the Pan-African Private Sector Trade and Investment Committee shows that the lack of information on markets, opportunities, and trading partners are the biggest constraints on exports. So how best can we get the message of the AFCFTA to trickle down, especially for small businesses?
Clearly, they've started doing some work. It was a very slow start. We need to get more support behind the work that they have to do at AFCTA. And we need to essentially, especially since they seem to be starting from regional engagement, and I think that's proper. And so that if you get West Africa flowing, I mean, ECOWAS was there all this while, but if you can get West Africa flowing a lot better than ECOWAS has gone, and the accomplishments in, for example, the East African area, and then those regions can trade with one another, we can make a lot more progress. It's particularly painful when you look at areas like services where Africans have such expertise that's going abroad. Part of the challenge when Nigeria was negative on the free trade area was, don't people realize in policy-making areas that Nigeria is so way ahead in services like banking, law, legal services, and all of that, that Nigerians could make a fortune in other parts of Africa, giving them the kind of services they're paying more for, and that's the whole idea of trade. They get quality service at lower cost in those countries from Nigeria, and Nigeria can exchange with those ones where those ones have their own comparative advantage. So the real challenge, I think, now is to not only drive all of those, but to get policymakers to recognize that they need to focus on their latent comparative advantage and value chains that flow from those, and those become the basis for exchange amongst Africa. I mean, look at the volume of trade amongst Asian countries compared to the volume of trade between African countries. I think we need to set very clear benchmarks of how far we want to go on those tracks relative to, say, some regions of the world like Asia.
That's the most difficult part, or the most challenging part, because the AFCFTA is going to benefit to the private sector. And when you talk about private sector development in Africa, it's not only about the large companies, it's also about the small businesses, women and youth entrepreneurs. But they have to be aware of what this AFCFTA means in concrete terms. So it's very important to demystify this agreement, to explain what will be the benefit of this instrument, but also, how to comply with the new rules and regulations that will be put in place. And this is why the AFCFTA Secretariat and other African stakeholders at, country level, also at the regional economic communities level, and with some development partners, including the International Trade Center, we are trying to promote, to sensitize, and to engage the private sector, especially small businesses, so that they can understand what this AFCFTA is going to bring for us in terms of market opportunities. Because, again, this is very important. And at the beginning, it's true that, it was mainly known by policymakers, chief negotiators, politicians. But today, more and more businesses are aware of this AFCFTA and about the opportunities that this agreement is going to bring, in terms of, export earnings, in terms of, let's say, innovations, in terms of increasing their turnover and also creating jobs. So, yes, so today what we are doing is really to demystify a little bit this agreement, to make it close to the people at grassroots level so that they can see the tangible benefit. Of course, it's a process. It's not something that is going to happen just, you know.
It's a journey from,
it's a journey.
from awareness
exactly,
to action.
Exactly. Because they need to get the skills, they need to understand how to comply, and they need to produce according to the new, regulation requirements.
The Africa Export-Import Bank is expanding with subsidiaries and specialized initiatives. CEO of Afreximbank, Jonas Mushosho, speaks to me on the importance of insurance to drive trade on the continent.
Whenever you talk about a crisis, you're really talking about risk. And insurance is at the heart of how do you mitigate and how do you manage risk. So Afreximbank is a 100% owned subsidiary of the bank. It is an insurance management services company, which basically means that it provides management services along the insurance value chain that have been provided to it by risk carriers. What we do, we actually provide specialty insurance covers for trade and trade-related investments. When people talk about Africa rising, they are trying to capture a number of things, but for me, they are capturing the reality, the dreams, aspirations, and the hope of a continent and its 1.3 billion people. If you have been privileged, as I have been, to go up and down the African continent, one very clear thing that you see is the pace of economic development, infrastructure construction, and of course, the trade and the movement of goods. So once you talk about all these things, the question that rises is, they create risk. Where do you get the insurance? The kind of insurance that is required for this is what we call specialty insurance. And unfortunately and sadly, specialty insurance is not well developed on the continent. We have to depend on people from outside, companies from outside, and Afreximbank, as Africa's trade bank, wants to make a difference to make sure that we can actually develop specialty insurance on the continent. And while we are doing that, also ensure that our customers and any African or any company doing projects on the African continent or doing trade or trade-related investments can find an opportunity and ways in which they mitigate this risk. That's where we bring in the specialty insurance. What do we cover? So we design solutions, fit-for-purpose solutions for specialty insurance for anyone that is involved in trade or trade-related investments. We make sure that we give access to the vital covers that you need in this respect. You also get access to quality specialty insurance.
We have been honored and we are grateful to every person who took the effort and the time to come over, to fly to Egypt and spend with us those few days. And I hope that they have found that their experience was fruitful and satisfying. I hope that our teams in the central bank and the banking system have been able to get to know their brothers and partners in Africa more, to open grounds for establishing more new relationships. Now we can open our minds and start looking further ahead. I think the banking system should lead investors and lead international and inter-Africa trade. To thank Professor Benedict Orama for his excellent support and working with us for this arrangement. I wish them good luck in their shareholders meeting. I thank him for his sincerity in driving this institution, and I assure him that we will always be supportive.
I think Tarek said it all. Afreximbank is a platform for connecting African people, African businesses, for making transactions happen. And these past few days, we have proven that. If you look across this beautiful, magnificent venue, you can see thousands of people gathered here. We are gathered here not because we cannot afford the meal, or we do not have anything to do this evening. We gather here because we are drawn by the force of the need to use trade as an instrument not only to integrate us, but also to develop us as a people. For years, we've complained about being marginalized in the world. For years, we've blamed others for the very sorry situation we find ourselves in the continent. But for once, we're beginning to do something about it, the way we did something about our political independence some 60 years ago. If you look around, this new administrative capital begins to tell you about the possibilities, about what is possible. I know that many of our brothers and sisters who are visiting here from different parts of Africa have taken pictures of what they are witnessing here, pictures of the miracle they are witnessing. And I hope that when they go, they will be able to also convey the message that His Excellency, our main host, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, conveyed to us yesterday. We have to work hard, do all we can to change the situation by ourselves. Somebody who will change it for us. And the bankers around us must know that the big constraint is money, capital. And Interreg has said what needs to be done. We need to also integrate. I'm very pleased that we are working with many of you to begin to chart that course, to make the banks in Egypt to work with the banks in the rest of Africa, to make sure that we begin to work together to build our infrastructure. But we must do more. So let me thank once again the Central Bank of Egypt for hosting us and for organizing this dinner. And I hope you will enjoy the dinner. I hope you will remember the events we've had these past few days and go home with the important message that have been delivered, that we must work hard amongst ourselves as Africans to begin to change our lot, to begin to develop ourselves. So only when we do that, that others can come along to help us.
Indeed, the 29th annual meetings of the Africa Export-Import Bank raised some pertinent questions on how best the continent can forge ahead in its aspiration to move people, goods and services across borders and shore up the volume of trade within the region. I'll leave you with some scenes from the meetings. I'm Kenneth Igbomo. Thanks for watching.